Please, make sure like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, can you please tell me when and where and what time you're watching? Thanks.
When I was about 9 years old, I lived with my mom and little sister in a small house in a quiet town. The street was mostly safe, the kind of place where kids would ride their bikes until the streetlights flickered on. Our house was at the end of a cul-de-sac, nestled under the shade of two massive oak trees that seemed ancient, their branches scratching against the roof like bony fingers when the wind blew. My mom used to say the house had character. She loved its creaky floorboards, the slightly crooked door frames, and the old-fashioned glass doorknobs. "It's just old, sweetie," she'd tell me whenever I jumped at a sudden noise. "Old houses make noises. They settle. It's like they're breathing." But I knew even then that some of the things I heard and felt in that house had nothing to do with settling foundations or expanding wood. These sounds weren't the house breathing. They were something else entirely. Something conscious. Something that listened back. The first incident, the one that shattered my childish illusion of safety, happened on a Tuesday night. I remember because Tuesday was meatloaf night, and the heavy, greasy feeling in my stomach made it hard to sleep. I was lying in bed, the faded superhero comforter pulled up to my chin, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars stuck haphazardly on my ceiling. My room was small and perpetually dim, lit only by a sliver of moonlight filtering through the slats of my window blind. The furniture was a collection of hand-me-downs, a scuffed dresser with a sticky bottom drawer, a wobbly nightstand, and a large wooden toy chest at the foot of my bed where I kept my action figures and Legos. I was tracing the familiar constellations on my ceiling when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic scratching. It was so soft I almost mistook it for a cricket outside. But this was different. It was coming from inside the room. It was slow, deliberate. Scratch, pause, scratch, pause, like something was gently dragging a single sharp nail across a rough surface. My blood went cold. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, every muscle in my body tensed. The sound seemed to be emanating from the wall behind my headboard, the shared wall between my room and the hallway. I told myself it was a tree branch. I told myself it was the house settling with a dramatic flair. But the oak trees were in the front yard. This was the back wall. Then, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was somehow louder and more terrifying. It was the silence of something listening, waiting to see if I had heard it. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for sleep, for the sound to not come back. For what felt like an hour, there was nothing, just the frantic hammering of my own heart in my ears. I must have drifted into a fitful sleep, because the next thing I knew, a much louder noise jolted me awake. It was a distinct, solid thump from inside the wall. Not a scratch, a knock. It was followed by another, and another. 3 firm, spaced-out knocks, right behind the head of my bed, vibrating through the wood and into my skull. I didn't scream. I couldn't. A paralyzing fear, cold and thick, had seized me completely. I slid down under my covers, pulling them over my head, creating a suffocating but safe cocoon. I lay there trembling, sweating, listening for any further sound. None came. Eventually, exhaustion overpowered fear, and I fell into a deep, black sleep. The next morning, sunlight streamed into my room, making the events of the night before feel like a distant, bad dream. I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. That was, until I went to get dressed. My sock drawer, which was in the dresser pushed against that very wall, was stuck. I tugged on it, and it gave way with a screech. Inside, my neatly folded socks were a jumbled mess. And there, carved into the soft pine at the back of the drawer, were 3 deep, fresh gouges. They weren't random scratches. They were parallel lines, evenly spaced, as if made by 3 furious fingers. I ran to show my mom, my words tumbling out in a panicked rush. She examined the drawer, her face a mask of calm practicality. "Oh, honey," she sighed, running her fingers over the grooves. "This old dresser has seen better days." The wood warps. It was probably stuck, and you pulled too hard. The nails from the joint in the back must have scraped it. But it sounded like knocking. "Inside the wall," I insisted, my voice trembling. She knelt down, placing her hands on my shoulders. "It's an old house. The pipes knock sometimes. It's probably just Mr. Henderson next door putting his tools away in his garage late at night. You've got an active imagination." She kissed my forehead. "It's nothing to be scared of." Her explanation was logical, comforting, and I desperately wanted to believe it. For a few days, I almost did. The house was quiet. I started sleeping a little easier. Then my 5-year-old sister, Lily, started having nightmares. She'd wake up screaming, night after night, claiming a bad man was in her dreams. My mom would soothe her, blaming the spicy pizza or the scary cartoon she might have glimpsed. But Lily's nightmares became more specific, more persistent. One afternoon, she was coloring at the kitchen table while I built a Lego spaceship on the floor. Out of nowhere, she looked up and said, in that matter-of-fact way only children can, "The Sandy Man doesn't like it when we're loud." I stopped, a red Lego brick in my hand. "The who?" "The Sandy Man," she repeated, not looking up from her coloring book. "He lives in the walls. He's all dusty." Oh, a chill, completely separate from the kitchen's ambient temperature, crept down my spine. "Lily, what are you talking about?" "What Sandy Man?" She finally looked at me, her big blue eyes serious. "He whispers sometimes. In my vent." She pointed a crayon toward the heating vent on the floor near the hallway. "He says, shh." I ran to the vent, getting on my hands and knees to peer into the metal grill. It was dark, dusty, and silent. "There's no one there, Lily. It's just the furnace." "Not the furnace," she said simply. "The Sandy Man. He gets angry." I told my mom what Lily had said later that evening. Her face tightened for a fraction of a second, a flash of unease I rarely saw, before she forced a smile. "She's just repeating something she heard on TV, Mikey. You know how she blends her stories with real life. Don't encourage her." But that night, I noticed she checked the lock on the back door twice. The whispers started for me a week later. It was never anything intelligible. Just a faint, raspy susurration that seemed to seep from the air vents in my room. It was the audio equivalent of static, but with a cadence that suggested words, just on the edge of comprehension. I'd turn off my radio, hold my breath and listen, but the moment I focused, it would fade away, leaving me wondering if it was just the wind whistling through the ducts. The knocking, however, returned with a vengeance. It was no longer just 3 knocks. It would be rapid, frantic tapping, like someone trying to Morse code a message to me. Sometimes it would be a slow, heavy drag, like a body being pulled across the insulation inside the walls. I started sleeping with my pillow over my head, but the vibrations would travel through the bed frame and into my bones. I began to change. I was tired all the time, with dark circles under my eyes. I jumped at slamming car doors, at the phone ringing, at my own shadow. I avoided my room until the last possible second before bed. My mom attributed it to a growth spurt and bought me children's vitamins. The final straw before the climax was the smell. It started in the hallway, a faint dusty odor like old plaster and dry rot. Within a day, it had intensified and migrated to my room. It was the smell of something ancient and desiccated, of attic trunks and forgotten graves. It was the smell of dust, yes, but also of something meaty, something long since dried out. It was the sandy man. One night the smell was so overpowering it woke me from a dead sleep. The room was pitch black, the digital clock on my nightstand having blinked out, a victim of one of the house's frequent minor power flickers. The only sound was the frantic beating of my heart. And then, the scratching began again. But this time, it wasn't on the other side of the wall. It was on my side. It was coming from the inside of my closet door. Scratch, scrape, pause, scratch. Something was in my closet, and it wanted out. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen, listening to that horrible, methodical scraping. Minutes, hours. Time had lost all meaning in the absolute blackness of that room. My bladder felt ready to burst, but the idea of moving, of making even the slightest noise, was unthinkable. Then a new sound joined the scratching, a low, wet, rattling breath. It was the sound of lungs filled with dust, struggling to pull in air. It was coming from behind the closet door. A high, thin whimper escaped my lips before I could stop it. The scratching stopped instantly. The rattling breath stopped. The silence was a physical weight pressing down on me. It was listening. It had heard me. Terror, pure and absolute, flooded my system. This was no longer a mysterious noise or a sister's imaginary friend. This was a presence, a thing, in my room, and it knew I was awake. The doorknob on my bedroom door, the one that led to the hallway, began to jiggle. It wasn't a frantic shaking. It was a slow, deliberate turning, as if someone on the other side was trying to be quiet, trying the lock to see if it would give. My breath hitched in my throat. My mom? Had she heard me whimper? But she never locked her door, and mine didn't have a lock to begin with. It was just a simple push-button privacy lock on the inside, and I never used it. The jiggling stopped. A moment of silence. Then a single, loud knock on my bedroom door. It wasn't the knock of a parent checking on a child. It was hard, authoritative, demanding. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to be a dream, praying for my mom to call out my name. Instead, a voice spoke. It didn't come from the hallway door. It came from the closet. It was a dry, rasping whisper, like sandpaper on stone, but I heard every syllable with horrifying clarity. Let me in. It was not my imagination. It was not the house settling. The voice was real, and it was inches away from me. I screamed. I screamed like I had never screamed before, a raw, primal sound of utter terror that tore from my throat. I screamed for my mom. I screamed for help. I screamed just to drown out the memory of that whisper. Within seconds, I heard the thunder of footsteps in the hall. My bedroom door flew open, and light from the hallway spilled in, blinding me. My mom stood there, her face pale with panic, a baseball bat clutched in her hands. "Mikey, what is it? What's wrong? I was sobbing, hysterical, pointing a trembling finger at my closet. In there. There's something in there. It talked to me. My mom, to her credit, didn't hesitate. She flipped on the overhead light, flooding the room with a harsh, yellow glow. She marched to the closet, gripped the handle, and yanked the door open. I braced myself for some monstrous thing to lunge out at her. Nothing happened. She stood there, staring into the closet. My clothes hung neatly on the rod. My shoes were lined up on the floor. A box of old board games sat on the top shelf. See, she said, her voice a mixture of relief and exhaustion. There's nothing here, baby. You had a nightmare, a really bad nightmare. But the voice, the knocking. I stammered, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. It was a dream, she said firmly, coming to sit on the edge of my bed and pulling me into a hug. Her body was warm and solid, an anchor in my terrifying reality. Just a dream. I heard the wind howling outside right before you screamed. It must have rattled the door. That's all. She stayed with me until I fell asleep, leaving the hall light on and my door wide open. The rational world had reasserted itself. The closet was just a closet. The voice was a dream. But as I drifted off, my eyes fixed on the closet door she had left slightly ajar, I saw something she had missed. On the inside of the door, right at the bottom, where the wood was unfinished, were 3 fresh, deep scratches. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house was tense. My mom was quiet, nursing a strong coffee. Lily was clingy and hadn't spoken a word since waking up. The previous night had taken its toll on all of us. The climax of the horror didn't come that night, or the next. It came a week later, on a night my mom was working a late shift. A babysitter named Sarah, a high school girl from down the street, was watching us. She was nice enough, more interested in her phone than in us, but she represented a fragile layer of adult protection. I was putting Lily to bed when she started crying, refusing to lie down. He's angry, she whispered, her small body trembling. The Sandy man is angry because you screamed. There's no Sandy man, Lily, I said, trying to sound brave for her sake, despite the cold dread her words sent through me. He says he's not in the walls anymore, she whispered, her eyes wide and fixed on her bedroom door. He says he's in a house now. The floorboard in the hallway creaked. Lily and I both froze, our eyes locked on each other. The creak was loud, deliberate. Sarah was downstairs in the living room. We could hear the faint sounds of a TV sitcom laugh track. Another creak, closer this time. Then the distinct sound of a footstep. Then another. Something was walking down the hallway. Slowly, heavily. Each step was accompanied by a soft, gritty sound, like someone dragging their feet through sand. The footsteps stopped right outside Lily's door. The doorknob began to turn. It wasn't the jiggling from my room. This was a slow, complete rotation. The latch clicked open. I acted on pure instinct. I grabbed Lily, pulled her off the bed, and shoved us both into the small space between her bed and the wall, pulling the comforter down to hide us. We crouched there, holding our breath as the door swung inward. I dared to peek over the edge of the mattress. A figure stood in the doorway. It was tall, too tall, its head stooped to avoid brushing the top of the doorframe. It was man-shaped, but utterly wrong. Its body seemed to be made of a dark, shifting material, like a shadow given unstable form. But covering it, dusting its shoulders and head, falling from its arms with every movement, was a fine, pale sand. It glowed with a faint, sickly luminescence in the dark hallway. I couldn't see its face, just a dark smear where features should have been, but I could feel its attention sweep across the room, searching. It took a step inside, and the gritty, dragging sound was horribly loud in the silent room. It smelled of dust and decay. It was real. It was all real. Downstairs, Sarah called out, "Mikey? Lily? Everything okay up there?" The figure stopped. Its head, or the shape where its head should be, tilted slightly, listening to the sound of her voice. It seemed to consider its options. Then, with a sound like a sigh of shifting dust, it retreated, pulling the door closed behind it as it left. We heard its sandy footsteps move down the hall, not toward the stairs, but toward my room. Then, silence. Lily and I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. We finally crept out when Sarah came up to check on us, annoyed at us for not answering. We didn't tell her what we saw. We knew she wouldn't believe us. The next day, I told my mom everything. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I spoke in a flat, calm monotone, detailing the sandy man, the footsteps, the thing in the doorway. I showed her the new scratches on the inside of my closet door, the ones she had missed. She listened in silence, her face growing paler with every word. She didn't interrupt. She didn't tell me it was a dream. When I finished, she didn't say anything for a long time. She just got up, went to the phone, and called her work to say she wouldn't be in. Then she called my grandma and asked her to come watch us for a few days. She spent that entire day on the phone. She called a real estate agent. She called a lawyer. She called a priest. The priest came and walked through the house, sprinkling holy water and saying prayers in a low voice. He left, looking grim, telling my mom he had blessed the house, but that some places hold on to energy more strongly than others. We were gone within a month. My mom used all her savings for a deposit on a small, modern apartment on the other side of town. She told the real estate agent about structural issues and plumbing problems as the reason for our sudden move. She never mentioned the scratches or the whispers to anyone but me. On the day we moved out, as the last box was loaded into the truck, my mom stood with me on the front lawn, looking at the old house for the last time. The afternoon sun made it look almost peaceful. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you at first, Mikey," she said quietly, her arm around my shoulders. "I saw things too. I heard things. I thought if I ignored them, they would go away. I thought I was protecting you." "What did you see?" I asked. She took a deep breath. "A shadow, always out of the corner of my eye, standing in doorways. And once I woke up and the covers were pulled down to the foot of the bed. And there was a perfect handprint in the dust on my nightstand." She shuddered. This house was never ours. We were just living in its space. When I was 10 years old, my family moved into a bigger house because my mom had just gotten remarried. We needed more space, and the new place on Blackwood Lane seemed perfect. It was a 2-story colonial with a wide porch and a huge backyard that ended in a line of dense, dark pine trees. It was newer than our old house, clean and bright, and located in a quiet neighborhood where kids still played kickball in the street until dusk. I truly believed, that we had finally left all the unease of our old life behind. I was wrong. The fear didn't vanish. It just put on a new face, a white one. My new bedroom was at the end of the upstairs hall. It was a kid's dream room. 2 large windows that looked out over the sprawling backyard, a deep walk-in closet, and built-in bookshelves. I loved it instantly. For the first week, everything was normal. The house was silent in a way our old one never was. No creaks, no groans, no mysterious knocks. It was a blank slate. The first sign that something was wrong with the slate was the closet. I woke up around 2 a.m. on my 8th night there, pulled from a deep sleep by a sound so soft it was almost a feeling. It was a shuffling, a gentle rustling, like silk pajamas brushing together, or someone slowly turning the pages of a tissue-thin book. It was coming from inside the walk-in closet. My heart immediately started that familiar, frantic drumming against my ribs. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. It's just the new house, I told myself, repeating my mom's old mantra. New houses make noises too. It's the air vents. It's the insulation settling. But then the closet door moved. It didn't swing open. It shuddered. A quick, violent tremble, as if someone on the other side had given it a single, frustrated shove. The knob rattled softly in its fitting. I stared, my eyes wide in the moonlit darkness, unable to even blink. I wanted to run to my mom's room, to wake my new stepdad, but a paralysis of pure, cold fear had glued me to the mattress. I just stared at the door, waiting, until the pre-dawn light began to bleed through the windows, and exhaustion finally dragged me back into a troubled sleep. The next morning, the closet door was open a crack, just an inch. I knew with a certainty that chilled my blood that I had shut it tight before going to bed. I always did. I asked my mom if she'd been in my room, maybe to put away laundry. She shook her head, sipping her coffee. Probably the air pressure from the heating system, honey. These newer houses are sealed up tight. The doors pop sometimes. I wanted to believe her. I tried, but the seed of dread had been planted. The shuffling in the closet became a nightly occurrence. Some nights it was faint, barely audible. Other nights it was more persistent, accompanied by a soft, rhythmic tapping, like a fingernail gently rapping on the inside of the closet wall. I started sleeping with my bedside lamp on, a pathetic circle of yellow light that did nothing to push back the shadows in the corners of the room. Then, the tapping moved. It started on my window. My room was on the 2nd floor. There were no trees near enough for branches to touch the glass. The first time I heard it, tap, 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 I froze, my book falling from my hands. It was a polite, almost curious sound. I told myself it was a bug, a June beetle knocking against the pane. But the tapping would continue for minutes on end, stop when I pulled the covers over my head, and start again the moment I emerged. After 3 nights of this, my curiosity, or maybe a desperate need to prove it was nothing, overpowered my fear. The tapping started again, soft and insistent. I took a deep breath, crept out of bed, and slowly approached the window, my reflection ghostly in the dark glass. I peeled back the edge of the blinds. A hand was pressed against the outside of the pane. It was pale white, almost luminous against the darkness of the night. The fingers were long and slender, the skin waxy and smooth. It wasn't clawing or scratching. It was just placed there, its palm flat against the glass, as if feeling for the warmth of the room inside. My brain short-circuited. This was the 2nd floor. There was no ledge, no ladder, no way for anyone to be out there. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet and crashing to the floor. I scrambled back into bed, pulling the covers completely over my head, shaking so violently I thought my bones would break. The tapping did not return that night. The next morning, I finally broke. I told my mom and stepdad, Dan, over breakfast. I described the hand in detail, my voice trembling. Dan chuckled into his orange juice. A hand? Come on, Mikey. You've been watching too many monster movies. My mom's reaction was worse. She didn't laugh. She gave me a patient, pitying smile. Oh, honey, you are probably half asleep. It's called a hypnagogic hallucination. Your brain was still dreaming even though you were awake. It felt very real, but it wasn't. I insisted, my voice rising to a desperate pitch. I was awake. I was reading. I know what I saw. Dan's smile vanished, replaced by irritation. You're too old for this attention-seeking nonsense, Mike. Enough. But I noticed something later that night. Dan, who always mocked me for needing a nightlight, made a point of turning on the bright hallway light before going to bed. He was scared too. He just wouldn't admit it. A month after we moved in, my 4-year-old brother, Ben, started talking about his new friend. The white lady, he called her. He said she was very pretty and very tall, and she liked to sit on the edge of his bathtub when he was taking a bath. My mom cooed and said it was sweet he had an imaginary friend. Then one night, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the house. It was Ben. I was out of my bed before I even knew what I was doing, my own fear forgotten. I reached his room just as my mom and Dan did. Ben was curled into a tight ball under his blanket, sobbing hysterically. When he finally calmed down enough to speak, his words were broken by ragged hiccups. The white lady, she was by the door. She was staring at me. It was just a bad dream, buddy, Dan said, his voice forcedly cheerful. Ben shook his head violently. No, she was there. Her eyes were all black. No whites, just black. I felt the food in my stomach turn to lead. I believed him completely. I had seen the hand. He had seen the owner. My bravery evaporated. I started sleeping with the blanket completely over my head, a stifling, sweaty practice that was the only thing that made me feel remotely safe. But it didn't stop the dreams. I began to dream of her, too. The white lady. She never spoke in these dreams. She just stood in the corner of my room, her form flickering like a silent film, and pointed a long, pale finger at me. I'd wake up gasping, the memory of her oppressive presence clinging to me like a cobweb. The line between dream and reality began to blur. Sometimes I'd wake up and still hear a faint, dry whispering, like leaves skittering across pavement, just on the edge of hearing. It seemed to come from the air vent on the floor. It sounded like my name. The climax happened on a night of a terrible storm. The wind howled around the house like a banshee, and rain lashed against the windows in great sheets. The violent weather was almost a relief. Its noise drowned out the possibility of hearing any other, more sinister sounds. I fell asleep to the drumming of the rain. I was awakened by a different sound, a slow, grating creak. I opened my eyes. My window was opening. The latch, which I had locked tight before bed, was slowly, impossibly, turning counterclockwise by itself. I watched, hypnotized by terror, as the lock fully disengaged and the window began to slide upward. Wind and cold rain blasted into the room, spraying my face and soaking my bed sheets. And then she came in. The white lady flowed over the windowsill. She didn't climb. She was like smoke, a cascade of white, formless fabric that coalesced into a shape in the middle of my room. She was taller than any person I had ever seen, her head mere inches from the 9-foot ceiling. A long, tattered white gown hung from her thin frame, moving in a breeze that wasn't in the room. Her hair was long and black, a void against the luminous white of her skin and dress. And her face. It was pale and smooth like a porcelain doll's, but her eyes were two bottomless black pits. She drifted toward my bed, her feet not touching the floor. The coldness radiated from her, a deep, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the storm. She leaned over me, and I was frozen, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Her face was inches from mine. I could see nothing in those black eyes but my own terrified reflection, tiny and helpless. She opened her mouth, and a breath colder than ice washed over me. It smelled of damp soil and forgotten places. And then she spoke. Her voice was the dry, rasping whisper from my dreams, the sound of dead leaves crushed in a fist. "Michael," I screamed. I screamed with every ounce of air in my lungs, a raw, continuous sound of absolute terror. I screamed so hard I felt something tear in my throat. The door burst open. The overhead light flicked on, blinding me. My mom and Dan stood there, breathless and alarmed. The white lady was gone. The window was closed and locked. The only evidence of the storm was the rain still hitting the glass outside and the water dripping from my hair and onto my soaked pillow. "What? What is it?" my mom cried, rushing to my side. She was here, the white lady. She came through the window. She said my name." I was sobbing, hysterical, pointing a shaking finger at the now closed window. Dan strode to the window and yanked on the latch. "It's locked, Mike." "See, it's locked tight." He looked back at me, and his face was a mixture of anger and genuine concern. "You were dreaming." "It was the storm. You had a night terror." "I wasn't asleep. I was awake. The window was open. I'm wet. Look at me," I pleaded, holding up my soaked pajama sleeve. "You probably sweated out during a bad dream," my mom said, though her voice was unsure as she touched my wet hair. "It happens." Oh, Mikey. They stayed until I calmed down, but their words were hollow. They didn't believe me. They couldn't reconcile what I was describing with the locked window and the empty room. The worst part? The moment between seeing her lean over me and my scream was a complete blank. It was as if my mind had simply shut off to protect itself. I had no memory of her leaving or the window closing. All I had was the terrifying bookends of the memory. Her face in mine, and then my parents bursting in. Things changed after that night. My mom started taking me to a therapist, a nice woman with a gentle voice who talked to me about anxiety and lucid dreaming. Dan treated me with a kind of cautious distance, like I was a fragile, potentially explosive device. I never saw the white lady fully again, but I felt her. I'd catch a glimpse of a white shape darting past a doorway at the edge of my vision. I'd wake up to find my closet door wide open. Ben stopped talking about her completely, but sometimes I'd hear him crying softly in his room at night, muttering, "Go away. Please go away." I think he had just learned that adults didn't want to hear the truth. We lived in that house for 3 more years. I never got used to it. The fear became a low-grade hum in the background of my life, a constant companion. I became an expert at avoiding dark corners and never looking too long into reflective surfaces at night. When I was 13, Dan got a job transfer, and we moved again. The relief I felt driving away from Blackwood Lane for the last time was a physical sensation, like a weight being lifted from my chest. Years later, when I was in college, I worked a summer job with a guy who'd grown up in my old neighborhood. Over beers one night, I mentioned I'd once lived on Blackwood Lane. His face went serious. "No kidding? Which house?" I described it. He let out a low whistle. "Dude, that house. Everyone in the neighborhood knew about it. It was built in the late 80s, right? On that old parcel of land that used to be part of the Blackwood estate." I nodded, my mouth going dry. "The story," he continued, "was that the original owner's wife went crazy, postpartum depression or something. She always wore these long white nightgowns. One night during a huge storm, she drowned her infant daughter in the bathtub. Then she hanged herself from a beam in the master bedroom closet." He took a swig of his beer. "They say she still looks for her kid, wanders the house, checking rooms, peeking in closets. They say she especially watches little boys." I never told him my story. I just sat there, the cold beer in my hand, forgotten, as the pieces clicked into place with a horrifying finality. The shuffling in the closet, the hand on the window, a mother checking on a child, the presence in Ben's bathroom, her whispered name for me. It wasn't random malice. It was a grief so profound it had stained the very walls of that house. I'm a grown man, with a son of my own now. I live in a single-story house with no closets in the bedrooms, a design choice my wife finds quirky but humors. When a storm kicks up at night, I still feel a primal jolt of fear. I'll get up and double-check the locks on the windows, my heart pounding a rhythm I learned as a boy on Blackwood Lane. I'll glance into the corners of my son's room, not for monsters, but for a glimpse of shifting white. My parents still think it was a series of night terrors, a childhood phase. Sometimes, I almost let myself believe that too. It's easier, safer. But then I remember the feel of the cold rain on my face. I remember the smell of wet earth and decay. And I remember the look in my little brother's eyes, a look not of imagination, but of witnessed horror. The White Lady wasn't a dream. She was a tragedy, trapped in a loop, and for 3 long years, we were forced to live inside of it with her. When I was 8 years old, my world was measured in sidewalk cracks and the distance I could ride my bike before my mom called me home for dinner. I lived on a quiet, tree-lined street where everyone knew each other, and the biggest danger was scraping your knee on the pavement. My life was simple, predictable, and safe. Until I met the man on the driveway, my daily ritual was sacred. After school, I'd grab my bike from the garage and pedal up and down our block, tracing the same route over and over, until the streetlights hummed to life. There was one house, midway down the block, that always held my attention. It was a well-kept ranch-style house with a long concrete driveway that swept up from the sidewalk to a detached garage tucked in the back. The lawn was always perfectly manicured, but the curtains were often drawn, giving the place a quiet, secretive feel. And every afternoon, like clockwork, he was there. An older man, standing at the point where his driveway met the public sidewalk. He was always dressed in neat, casual trousers and a collared shirt, and he always, without fail, wore a brown tweed flat cap. He'd stand there, hands in his pockets, watching the street with a calm, placid expression. He never ventured onto the sidewalk itself, and he never seemed to be doing anything but watching. The first time I rode past, he gave a small, friendly wave. I, taught to be polite, waved back. The next day, he called out, "Nice day for a ride." I nodded shyly and kept pedaling. By the end of the week, we had a routine. I would approach, slow my bike, and he would offer a greeting. "How was school today, son? Did your team win the game?" "That's a fine bike." The bell's a nice touch. His voice was kind, gravelly, but warm. He never asked me to come closer, never stepped off his property. It felt normal, neighborly. I started to look forward to our brief daily chats. He was a constant, a friendly landmark on my daily route. He knew things too, little things. One day, he mentioned my little brother by name. "How's Timmy liking kindergarten?" he asked. I was too young to find it strange. I just figured my mom had talked to him at some point. Another time, he noted that my dad had finally fixed the squeaky wheel on my bike. "Glad to hear that racket quieted down," he'd said with a chuckle. I laughed with him, pleased that he'd noticed. The relationship had rules, boundaries set by my mother and, it seemed, respected by him. I was never to cross the street by myself. He never invited me to. Our conversations always took place with the curb between us. Him on his driveway, me on the street. It was a safe, predictable distance. One Saturday, my dad took me to the bike shop, and I got a brand new bike. It was fire engine red with gleaming chrome, and a bell that rang with a clear, triumphant ding-ding. I was bursting with pride. I couldn't wait to show it off on my route. I pedaled down the block, my heart swelling as the new tires hummed on the pavement. I saw him standing in his usual spot, and I slowed to a stop right at the curb. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Well, would you look at that?" he said, his voice full of appreciation. "That's a real beauty." "Thanks," I said, beaming. "It looks fast," he said, nodding approvingly. "I bet you could race me to the corner and win." The corner was about 50 yards away. I looked at it, then back at him. The idea was thrilling, but immediately quashed by my mother's #1 rule. "I can't," I said, my shoulders slumping. "I'm not allowed to cross the street." His smile never wavered. It was kind, understanding. "Of course. Rules are rules." Maybe one day he didn't press it. He never did. Instead, he told me a story about a dog he'd once had that would steal his slippers and hide them in the garden. I laughed, rang my new bell for him, and continued on my way. "One day," he'd said. The phrase stuck with me, a promise of a future adventure. Then one Tuesday, the routine broke. I rode down the block, and the driveway was empty. I slowed down, confused. Maybe he was just running late. I did another lap, still empty. The curtains on the house were drawn tight. A weird feeling of disappointment settled in my stomach. The street felt off balance without him there. This continued for a week. Every day, an empty driveway. The house looked still, silent, almost mournful. My rides became less fun. I'd pedal slowly past, hoping to see the familiar figure in the tweed cap, but the spot remained vacant. The mystery consumed me. Where had he gone? My curiosity finally overpowered my obedience. One afternoon, I saw a woman in the backyard of the house. I'd never seen anyone else there before. She had gray hair tied in a bun and was wearing gardening gloves, carefully pruning rose bushes. This was my chance. Maybe she knew him. I rode around the corner, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was breaking the rules. Big time. I stopped my bike a few houses down and watched her for a long time, working up the courage. She seemed nice enough. She didn't notice me. A few days later, I saw her again, this time sitting on the back porch with a mug of tea. This was it. I took a deep breath, looked both ways down the empty street, and pushed off. I crossed the street, my tires bumping over the curb onto his driveway. The concrete felt different under my tires, foreign and forbidden. The driveway was longer than it looked from the street, sloping gently upward. The garage door was closed. I felt a profound sense that I wasn't supposed to be there. I stopped my bike near a side gate that led into the backyard, my hands trembling on the handlebars. The woman heard the crunch of my tires on the gravel edging the driveway. She turned, her expression one of mild surprise. She wasn't alarmed, just curious. She stood up, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked to the gate, unlatching it. "Well, hello there," she said, her voice friendly. "Can I help you, young man?" I suddenly felt very small and very foolish. My words got stuck in my throat. I gestured vaguely toward the street. I was looking for the man who stands here. He talks to me when I ride my bike." Her friendly expression softened into something else, something sadder. "A man? What did he look like?" I described him in detail. The trousers, the shirts, the kind eyes, and most of all, the brown tweed flat cap. Her face went pale. She leaned against the gatepost, as if for support. That sounds like my Harold," she said quietly. "That's exactly what he wore. He loved to stand out here and watch the neighborhood. He said it was his daily review." A wave of relief washed over me. She knew him. "Is he here? Can I say hello?" She looked at me with such profound sadness that my relief instantly evaporated. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Harold, my husband, he passed away last year." The world didn't just stop, it tilted on its axis. The words didn't make sense. Passed away. I knew what that meant. It meant gone. It meant forever. "No," I stammered, shaking my head. "No, that's not right." "I saw him. I talked to him. Just last week." She didn't tell me I was lying. She didn't laugh. She just looked at me with those sad, tired eyes. "His name was Harold," she repeated, as if trying to make me understand. "He died right in his favorite armchair in the living room." Peacefully, in his sleep, I felt dizzy. The world was swimming. "See, is there a picture?" She nodded slowly. "Wait here." She disappeared into the house and returned a moment later holding a small framed photograph. She handed it to me. It was him. It was undeniably the man I talked to every day. He was standing right there on the driveway, wearing the same tweed cap with the same kind smile. But there was one difference, one detail I had never seen from the curb. A scar. A thin, pale line that started just below his left ear and carved a path down his cheek, disappearing into his jawline. I stared at it. My mind raced, flipping through a mental catalog of every interaction. I had never seen a scar. His skin had always looked smooth, unmarked. "He got that scar in a car accident when he was a young man," the woman said softly. "He was self-conscious about it. He always grew a bit of stubble to hide it, but in pictures, you can always see it." I handed the photo back to her, my hand shaking. The man I talked to had no scar. The man in the picture did. The pieces of my reality were breaking apart. I have to go," I mumbled, already backing my bike away. "You're not the first, dear," she said gently. "The little girl who lived here before you, she used to tell her mother she talked to the nice man in the cap. We thought she was just imagining things. She gave me a look that was part pity, part something else. Fear, maybe. The house has been empty since Harold died. I just came back to take care of the garden. I didn't wait to hear more. I turned my bike around and pedaled down that long driveway as fast as I could, bursting back out onto the familiar sidewalk. I didn't look back. The bike ride home was the longest of my life. The world looked the same houses, the same trees, but it felt completely different. It felt like a thin veneer, and I had just seen a crack in it. I didn't tell my parents. What could I say? That I'd broken the biggest rule, crossed the street, and had a conversation with a widow who told me my friend was a ghost? They'd never let me out of the house again. I just put my bike in the garage and went to my room, silent and numb. For 2 weeks, I avoided that end of the block. I took different routes, circling the other way, my eyes fixed straight ahead whenever I had to pass that house. The driveway remained empty. The curtains stayed drawn. Life, on the surface, returned to normal. But the memory of him, of his kind voice and his scarless face, haunted me. Had I imagined it all? Was I like the little girl the woman mentioned? The thought was terrifying. Then, one rainy night, it happened. I was asleep when a sound pulled me from my dreams. It was a voice, faint but clear, carried on the wind and the patter of rain against my window. Michael. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart leaping into my throat. It was his voice, the man from the driveway. He said my name exactly as he always had, with that same gentle, gravelly warmth. I stayed frozen, listening. The rain fell steadily. Michael. There it was again. It wasn't coming from inside the house. It was coming from outside, from the street. I crept out of bed and went to my window. I peeled back the blind, my breath fogging the glass. The street was dark and slick with rain, illuminated by the hazy glow of the streetlights. It was empty. Michael, come outside. The voice was closer now. It wasn't shouted. It was an invitation, a coaxing call. It sounded like it was right under my window. A terror, cold and absolute, seized me. This wasn't a friendly chat across a curb. This was different. This was a boundary being crossed. He was calling me to him. One day, he had said. I stumbled back from the window, my legs turning to jelly. I fell to the floor, scrambling backward into the corner of my room. Go away, I whispered, my voice cracking. Please go away. Michael. The voice was persistent, almost pleading now. Let's race to the corner. I couldn't take it. I screamed. I screamed for my mom, for my dad, for anyone. I screamed so loud I drowned out the sound of the rain and the sound of his voice. My bedroom door flew open. Light flooded the room. My parents stood there, alarmed and sleep-rumpled. What? What is it? My dad asked, his voice thick with sleep. He's out there, I sobbed, pointing a trembling finger at the window. The man. He's calling me. He wants me to go outside. My mom rushed to the window and looked out. There's no one there, honey. It's just the wind. It wasn't the wind. It was him. He said my name. My dad sighed, running a hand over his face. He went downstairs. I heard the front door open and close. A moment later, he came back up, a flashlight in his hand. I walked the whole yard, Mike. There's no one out there, not a soul. You must have had a nightmare. They stayed with me until I calmed down, but their words were empty comfort. They didn't believe me. They saw a scared little boy who'd had a bad dream. But I knew. I had heard the promise in his voice. The promise of one day. I never heard his voice again. I never saw him on the driveway after that. The woman eventually moved away for good, and a new family bought the house. They painted it a different color, put up a swing set in the yard, and parked their minivan in that long driveway. The new landmark of my bike rides became their barking dog, not a lonely old man. I grew up. I got my driver's license and stopped riding my bike. I went to college and moved away. The memory of the man on the driveway became a strange, buried story from my childhood, one I'd occasionally tell to close friends late at night, always framing it as a weird kid story. But a few years ago, I was back in my hometown for a holiday. I found myself driving down my old street, a wave of nostalgia washing over me. The trees were bigger. Some houses had been remodeled, but it was essentially the same. And then I saw him. Not the man. A boy. He was about 8 years old, riding a blue bike with training wheels. He was pedaling slowly down the sidewalk, right toward the house with the long driveway. As I watched, he slowed to a stop right at the curb. He sat there on his bike, looking up the driveway toward the garage. He wasn't looking at the new minivan or the swing set. He was looking at a spot right at the end of the driveway, near the sidewalk, the exact spot. He lifted his hand and gave a small, shy wave. Then he pedaled away. I pulled my car over and sat there for a long time, my hands gripping the steering wheel, watching the empty spot. He hadn't been waving at a person. The driveway was empty. He had been waving at the air, at a memory, at a ghost. I never told that boy's parents what I saw. What would I say? I drove away. The image of his small wave burned into my mind. It was the confirmation I never knew I needed. It wasn't just me. It had never been just me. The rational adult in me still tries to find logic. Mass hysteria. A neighborhood tall tale that kids somehow pass down. But the 8-year-old boy inside me knows the truth. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I sometimes wonder why he chose me. Was he just lonely? Was he a harmless spirit, forever stuck in his daily review of the neighborhood he loved? Or was the invitation to race to the corner something darker? I'll never know. All I know is that the world is a stranger, more mysterious place than we are taught to believe. There are things that linger in the quiet spaces, in the liminal zones between sidewalk and driveway, between waking and sleep. And sometimes, if you're a lonely kid on a red bike, they wave back.
If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Echoes of Fear Tales for more chilling narratives. Stay tuned. Another haunting tale awaits you. Thank you for listening.